Suresh recently finished a stint in the Biden-Harris administration, where he served as Assistant Director for Science and Justice in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. In that capacity, he helped co-author the blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights. He was also named in 2023 by Fast Company to their AI 20 list of thinkers shaping the world of generative AI, and currently sits on the boards of the Data and Society Institute, the Partnership on AI, and the Ada Lovelace Institute. He is also co-chair of the ACM's AI and Algorithms Policy Committee. I'm also lucky to have him as my PhD advisor. Oh.
Thank you, Ruchi. One of the disadvantages of knowing the organizer of the conference well is that she told me what I was supposed to talk about, so. No, I'm kidding. Okay. Should I allow it contact? Yes, I should. Okay, all good. Thank you for inviting me here today. I'm happy to, I'm excited to talk about this interplay between research world and the policy world that many of us have been living in for a long time. I want to sort of frame this as a question both about, to Deb's sort of talk also, what we've learned from the past and how it can guide us. And I want to give you some examples of how in small, halting, incomplete ways, we and I and our group are thinking about ways in which we can continue this work of engaging with policy for the future. I wanted to quibble a little bit with the title of the event. I think the word translation comes in there. And I often think the word translation implies we are the arbiters of knowledge and we have to translate this for the outside world. I don't think of it that way. I think there's a rich conversation going back and forth. There are things that I, as a computer scientist, don't know about what policymakers want to know about. And talking to them helps me understand, oh, here's a question that would be useful to study to help policymakers understand what they should be thinking about, versus me going to them and saying, here I have this cool new thing, this new widget, or this should be helpful to you. And I think that bidirectional nature of the conversation, which other speakers have already spoken about, I think, is important to having a useful and productive dialogue here. And so I want to start with this whole question of what is socio-technical AI governance, right? It's a term that automatically puts you in one camp, but I happily embrace the camp that I think, thinking about people and systems together is important. AI governance we can think about in many ways, and broadly speaking, and Deb did this wonderful sort of overview of all the different ways we think about governance, it's a system of rules, practices, and processes to make sure the use of AI tech is in line with objectives and values. And of course, the hard work here is like, what objectives, whose values, and so on, right? And a socio-technical approach really recognizes that a technology's real-world safety and performance, again to the point of grounded evaluation, is always a part of both technical design but broader societal forces, including bureaucracy, labor, social conventions, and power, of course. And so you almost have to pay attention to that bigger picture if you want to not just be effective, but make sure that the systems you're putting out there are in line with objectives and values. Otherwise, at best, they will be ineffective. At worst, they will do things you absolutely don't want to have happen. So how do we, and I say continue to pursue socio-technical approaches to AI governance? I think it goes without saying that the world is moving along for a while in a certain direction, and then there was a shock to our system, maybe about a year and a half ago. And we have to reevaluate how we think about the role of governance and how we can pursue the things we want to pursue, right? But I think in that respect, there are many lessons we have learned. I didn't know Deb was going to do a retrospective as an elder statesman in the field. But as a young one myself, I'm going to sort of try and talk about my cool new research projects, that you can put in the context of what the seniors have talked about. So. And I think it's actually nice to see that, I see many similarities maybe in how, those of us who've been working in the space think about this, and that's a kind of comforting also, like I'm not going off the deep end, but also that there are common threads of thinking, right? I mean, and for me, in my own work, when I talk to my students, when I think about a paper and you think about, okay, what is the value of what we're doing here? I think about it in three parts, right? How are we framing questions? And I cannot emphasize enough how right now in the world of AI, so much of the battles that we're facing are framing battles. In other words, they're not arguments about which piece of intervention or which method to use. They're fundamental arguments about what the problem even is. And again, if you don't know what the problem is, you aren't going to solve it. And if you don't agree on what the problem is, you're going to be waffling around. And if there's political and sort of ideological fights about which problem should be solved, that is often the space we are in. So I think framing is a very important task to make sure that we are talking about the problems that we believe are the ones where we need to make progress on. And that doesn't mean big problems. It could even mean small problems. There are many places where people who disagree broadly ideologically have common points of agreement on specific issues. And if we can frame those questions specifically, we can make progress, right? And that's the essence of sort of collaborative competition, I guess, in the space. Another thing that I think we have done and can do very well, and I think Deb already mentioned this, is measuring and assessing what the level of a problem. So once you've agreed upon a problem, we need to understand how serious of a problem it is, because problems don't occur in a vacuum, especially when you're thinking about policy work. There's always a choice and a prioritization. And so you have to understand the significance of an issue and how important it is to address a particular issue versus some other thing that might be pressing. Should we handle data centers? Should we handle deepfakes? Should we be thinking about bias in decision making? Should we be thinking about the sort of geopolitics of AI? I mean, these are all reasonable questions in their own right, but at some point you have to decide which one to start with. And so measuring and assessment gives you a sense of how significant the issues are. And tools, I'm a computer scientist, we build stuff, building is cool, it's fun, but it's also a way to say, it's also a way to imagine different futures. The center I direct, it has many R's in it, and there's tech responsibility, of course, but there's also reimagination. I firmly believe that we can't just be sitting, bobbing around as the current takes us through the AI landscape. We have to exert much more agency over the futures we want to see and build the futures that we want. And so we can do that by building tools, by demonstrating what's possible, and then saying, hey, we know this is possible. Why not shape our policies and our guidance towards those kinds of things? So I want to give some examples of each of these. Again, these are just small examples. These are things we're playing with right now. I don't claim any of these are definitive or sort of the correct way, but they're the ways in which I like to think about some of these, how to address some of these issues. So let's start with framing. Right, so a paper that we sort of wrote recently was published in CS Law, actually up here like about a month ago, was on this question of generative versus predictive AI, right? So Deb talked about these two Senate hearings, right? One about AI in government, predictive AI systems for the most part, and one with Sam Altman, which is fundamentally about general purpose AI and Gen AI in general. Right? And I think everyone in this room understands the difference in these two systems. But what I have found, and perhaps many of you have found over and over again, is that when we're talking to folks in the States, city level, and often, while they have a general understanding of general purpose AI, Gen AI, what it is, there's a specific sense in which they don't understand why these two systems might be different and might require different ways of thinking when it comes to legislation and broader policy work. And it's funny because we spent like a year or so writing this paper, and I don't know, every 3 days, one of us would get a crisis of existential angst. Are we just saying something obvious? Should we not write this paper? And then one of us would like, no, it's fine. I talked to someone yesterday who had no clue the difference. We should write it. And this would keep happening over and over again. So we finally did write the paper. We did the battle with the reviewers for a while, and we got the paper out. And it was kind of funny that as soon as it came out, I started mentioning it to people, and it's like, oh, I never thought about that way. Can I get a reference? Can I take quote from your paper? And I'm sure. But I think the point is that sometimes things that are obvious or seem obvious are worth saying anyway, and that's a good thing to keep in mind. And so one of the reason why we felt like we had to write this was because we were seeing laws, or at least proposals coming out, that looked like they were trying to regulate all of AI, especially general purpose AI tools, using the toolkit that had been developed over many years for task-specific AI. So, because, and I blame people like myself and Deb and others for spending a lot of time educating legislators on all the ways in which you should do auditing of the various AI systems. And they're like, oh yeah, you told us all the stuff about explainability and bias mitigation. We should write that all for Gen AI. I'm like, no, that doesn't quite work. You can't do it that way. And so we started thinking about what makes general purpose AI different from a point of view of regulation, not in general. I mean, there are many things, but from point of regulation, what makes it different? And so we came up with sort of four dimensions of difference. One is, of course, that it's general adaptable, really makes a poor target for regulation because of this whole general purpose, dual purpose nature of the technology. They're difficult to evaluate because they're not task specific. If you take the latest version of ChatGPT and you sort of run it into in some specific decision-making setting without doing any kind of fine-tuning, it's very hard to sort of tell how well it's going to do or where it's going to start going nuts and start saying things it shouldn't be saying. It opens up, needless to say, areas of legal concern that we never had to worry about before, things like AI and copyright or CBR and harms, right, and other sort of national security issues and so on. And it's also built on a highly distributed value chain, which is really bad for accountability, right? If you have a very complicated value chain, it's very hard to then isolate, okay, who's responsible for what if something goes wrong? And now in other parts of the broader sort of regulatory environment, we have solved some of these problems. If a car breaks down, a car is a very complex piece of machinery that has many different parts. And there's a process in the courts to try and figure out who's responsible for what failure happened. But for AI, it's very hard because it's a moving target right now. And so we sort of came up with a couple of recommendations, right? Thinking about downstream application domains, only focusing on technology in very narrow circumstances, and encouraging people to focus on the entire ecosystem of harm and not just the technology itself. That's also very important because, for example, just to mention CBRN, the chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear weapons problems, if your concern is that AI can create a design for a chemical weapon, that is indeed a problem. But unless you also have a robot that's going to somehow go out and get the equipment and get the sort of the prescribed materials and build a chemical weapon, the problem is less serious than maybe in some other domains. And so this question of, okay, there's an entire ecosystem we've built up with regulations, with choke points, with checks to make sure certain harms don't happen. AI comes in and disrupts some of it. Does it disrupt enough of it that you have to have focus on the technology, or are there other places where you sort of instill your choke points and regulations to make sure the overall system is safe? This kind of thinking is very important, and I find it's been coming up over and over again in the context of AI. How do we think about the broader ecosystem of harm to be more specific and more concrete in how we analyze and propose regulation? And I want to give you one example of that in a follow-up paper that we did. Like most things I do, my claimed narrative that all this one topic flew to the next topic is all post hoc. At the time, I didn't think of it that way, but in retrospect, it does look like that. So this is paper that my colleague Harini Suresh and my student Michelle Ding are writing on the ecosystem of technologies that facilitate AI-generated non-consensual intimate images, which is a bit of a mouthful. I'll just say NCII. But basically, things like, it's not deepfake porn, it's worse. It's basically non-consensual sort of image generation used often to harass people, harm people in various ways. And so one of the main contributions of this work that is, where we've written is the first technological ecosystem that maps and taxonomizes 11 categories of technologies that facilitate the creation, distribution, proliferation, infrastructure support, and monetization of NCII. And so what's important about doing this kind of work is that if you start saying, oh, we need to build some policies around these and NCII, and in fact, 47 states have bills on this topic right now, what does it actually mean? Well, it means a whole bunch of things. It turns out there is a very, very complex ecosystem with technical actors as well as people, communities that facilitate the creation of this content. There's, of course, training data. There's the models themselves. There's interfaces. There's distribution platforms. There's communities on Telegram and other sort of settings where people go to get advice on how to build these systems, how to build more NCII. There's ad platforms used to sort of spread the word about where you can get these tools to build this content. Search engines are part of this. App stores, development platforms, things like GitHub, Civic AI, service providers, even payment processors, they're all implicated in different ways in how these systems come to be. So if you're a policymaker looking at concerns around NCI and you want to do something, it is helpful to understand the landscape and the complexity of the landscape and where you might intervene. And so for one example of how this ecosystem map can be useful is that you can look at legislation that's already been proposed or passed, for example, in the states, in the different states in the US, and see how do they map. So this gives you an example of that. Out of the 47 odd bills or states that have passed, only 5 states actually target the technical ecosystem that allows this content to be produced. Most of the other bills basically say, if you do this, this is a criminal offense, you can be punished, which is very important, right? It's important to direct, penalties for those who do this work. But it also doesn't address the broader question of the supply of the system. And so these 5 bills do, California, Colorado, Arkansas, Tennessee, and New York, and there's also the Federal Take It Down Act, which I didn't mention here. But as you can see, once you have this ecosystem, you can understand how they target different parts of it. Both New York, Colorado, and California target the distribution platforms. So they basically talk about the California bill is a state version of Take It Down, basically saying if you're a company that is putting up content and it is made known to you that this is content of this kind, you need to take it down, and there's an appeal process and time and the usual kinds of things there. Whereas Arkansas and Tennessee have gone after the generation processes. Now again, one might have discussions or debates over how effective these are going to be, how feasible they are to actually hold up in court. But they're targeting a very different part of the ecosystem. So if you look at this map and you look at the ecosystem itself, you see a lot of places that haven't been targeted. And in fact, there have been, we have a case study in our paper looking at the discussion on Grok and Grok's sort of suddenly last December, where a lot of people are generating NCII on Grok using their interface. It actually touches many of these components. And so having a map like this allows you to understand how payment processes are being involved, how dev platforms are participating in this, and how, if you want to intervene, you can't just take a whack-a-mole approach saying, okay, this is the latest atrocity, let's do something. You need to understand how the map works. It also means that you need to study how the different parts of the map interact with each other. This is a question for research, right? How, for example, do we know which models are the most commonly used models for NCII, GenAI interfaces? We actually don't know the answer to that. And there's some researchers who reached out to us after we wrote this paper saying they're actually beginning to study this, because it'd be good to know, okay, if there are 3 models that are being used for most of this, and the owners of those models, the developers, can be made to know, look, for some reason, your models are very popular for generating this content. Can you do something about this? And then maybe a conversation can happen. So these ecosystem maps are helpful to put forward as a way to gain insight into what's happening in these spaces and where regulation can be most effective. We also want to measure. We want to measure and assess, issues of various kinds. And in this respect, I want to, I've done a bunch of work on different kinds of ways of measuring problems in this space. But I also want to give an example of a project that we've been working on now for a couple of years to try and make sense of the plethora and variety of AI legislation coming up in the States. So the background for this is that over the last 2-3 years, there are probably at least, a couple of thousand bills that have been proposed in the US state, just in the US, that have something to do with AI regulation in some broad. They've ranged from, we passed a resolution saying that bad AI is bad, to we want a comprehensive bill that covers all aspects of consumer protection with AI, like the Colorado bill, right? So there's a whole spectrum. I'm not saying all thousands of them are the same merit or scope, but there is a range. And it has also become very clear that understanding this landscape of bills, understanding how states are legislating, understanding what sort of trends are popping up. It's almost like, when you live in a research community and suddenly there's a trend, and every year, like, there's a whole bunch of new papers and agents. Like, suddenly this year is the year of deepfakes, and all the states are publishing bills on deepfakes, and next year will be a new trend. It's actually helpful to understand these trends because states look to each other. Right? States don't want to stick out their necks too far ahead of other states. They want to know what's happening and where they can conform to what other states are doing. Right? So without necessarily being fully aligned, they want to have things that are more or less consistent. So we started this project at the center I direct. It's called Center Isle, to help the public, journalists, researchers, and policymakers identify policy trends and assess the maturity of emerging sort of proposals. The way it works is, and we just announced, we just launched the first version of this a couple of months ago, and the goal is to sort of help build profiles of bills, and I'll tell you a little bit about what these profiles look like. So we want to get bills in. We want to do some analysis of these bills with a bunch of experts and sort of and students who are working on analyzing these bills, and build essentially a summary profile for a bill that sort of says something interesting about it. So for example, if you look at TREGA, which is the Texas bill on regulating the use of AI, one of the things our system produces is the summary of the bill itself, sort of a set of questions. We have about 150 questions now that we have people reading a bill and answering to score the bill on different categories, whether it's accountability, data protection, bias, AI in education, synthetic content, and so on, and then look at significant questions that are answered by this bill. And I have personally found this very useful. Someone from some state will call me up and say, oh, we're writing this bill, do you have any thoughts on it? And actually we have it already in our database, and someone has analyzed it. I can look at some of the key elements in this bill and what it's focusing on and what it's not focusing on. So this is a kind of a project that we're building up. So this is one of the outputs of our process. And what we do is we take bills from all across the states using Legiscan. We put them into our database. We run each of these bills through our scoring process with people, scorers we've sort of brought on to sort of score the bills, and we have an interface that does it. And then once we have that, we can build this profile and build insights into it. But it turns out we can do much more, because once we have the information about the bills in the form of the questions that have been answered about the bill, these 150 questions that are answered about them, as well as the raw text of the bills, we can do all kinds of other automated analysis as well. And so we wrote this paper with our colleagues at the ACLU, which is titled Using AI to Make Sense of AI Policy. And we have, for example, We have a process by which we can take a whole collection of bills and do essentially a text-based interbill analysis to find themes and trends in them. And we can even do sort of things within a bill to look at how, for example, a bill constructs its definitions, which, as you know, is a key part of writing a bill, getting right definitions and how they interact with each other. So, for example, in our report, we have, we could look at different trends, and sorry for this being a little small, you can look at trends across the states of when you cluster bills, what kind of trends seem to emerge and what are popular trends of the year, right? What is the new black for sort of AI legislation in 2024 and 2025? You can compare bill text to each other. There are a lot of model bills out there in the world, and you can look at actual bills and see how they compare to model bills to understand where these bills sit in sort of ideological sort of space between the different model bills that different ideological camps propose. You can compare this across multiple bills. You can look at, these bills are similar to this bill, model bill on employment from Workday. There's another model bill on AI regulation from ALEC, and there's one from the Lawyers Committee. As you can imagine, they occupy very different points on the ideological spectrum, so you can see where bills lie between them. And this is something that advocates of all sort of stripes like to sort of understand. And you can do something more complicated. So this is a cool thing. You can build sort of structures, graphs from the ways in which definitions interact with each other within a bill. And sometimes bill definitions have cycles in them, which can be of concern sometimes if your definitions are cyclic. But you can also look at this to say which definitions are very salient, which definitions are load-bearing within a bill, because that's where you want to make sure that you get it right, or that you have the right definition in place, especially for things like definitions of AI, which often come up a lot in this space. So we're going to do much more of that. We want to do, I was intrigued by the discussion of LLM and deliberative democracy, because I think you can imagine we've been playing with, for example, having agents, AI agents, take on personas of different stakeholders in the space. Like we have an OpenAI agent, and then we take all of, like A16Z's public postings as another sort of agent. And we take postings from ACLU, and we take postings from other sort of stakeholders, and have these agents argue about a bill, and then see which phrases are most likely to disagree on. And you start surfacing very interesting sort of observations just doing the automated process. It's not, I would say, ready for prime time yet, but I think there's a promise there in trying to use AI tools to help surface interesting points in the bill that would make it easier to process these many, many hundreds of bills that are popping up now, just to help with the analysis. A last thing I want to talk about is tools, right? So one of the things that no one ever reads in the AI Bill of Rights, because it's many, many pages long, is the entire technical companion, which is everything after the actual 5 principles themselves. It's a part that we were most proud of writing because we're computer scientists and we're nerdy like that, but no one else wanted to read. And the whole point of the technical companion was to outline practical steps that can be implemented to realize the vision of the blueprint, right? It mirrored existing practices for technology deployments, testing, monitoring systems, and governance structures. The reason we could even write that was because there had been a decade of work before the document came out with people working out how to do testing, how to measure different kinds of bias, how to do post-deployment monitoring, pre-deployment testing, how to do auditing, right? So all of this work was already out there. It was not then a big step to say, look, this stuff is already out there. We know how to do this. It's not a big deal to say, implement this in your systems. Right? Especially when some of the pushback against us is like, oh, this stuff you're asking us to do is too hard. We can never figure out how to do it. It's really, really complicated. And then you're like, really? There's like 10 papers on this. It's not that hard. So in other words, building tools, building artifacts helps change the discussion as well. It helps change the discussion about what's feasible, what's possible, what's imaginable. And we should do more of it, because it's also a positive vision for the future, as opposed to just, sitting and wagging our fingers like this bad, which is no fun, frankly. And no one wants to be the scold. And so in that regard, I just want to give an example. Deb talked about the sort of many mechanisms we already have for AI accountability, different kinds of architectures for auditing. And we've been playing with, actually with Victor, Victor who worked with Deb, we've been playing with sort of new ideas for how to build end-to-end audit structures, the thing you just said we should have more of. So you should read his paper. So and so the work he's been working on is really how to build an end-to-end chronological, tamper-evident, and context-rich ledger of events and decisions across the whole process of building the AI pipeline. And the motivation was, I think, as you mentioned, right, these systems exist in other parts of the world. In healthcare and finance, there are legally mandated systems for doing these end-to-end audits. And there's no reason we can't expect this to be true or build something like this for AI systems. So to that end, he's been working on essentially an architecture, a system that allows you to capture and through emitting events during the build and deployment of LLMs, which was surprisingly easy for him to do because most standard interfaces for building LLMs already have the ways to send out information once you made a particular choice of build. There are these hooks you can call on to spit out information about the build process. Then you store all this in a tamper-evident repository, and then you can use it to do querying, to do verification, to reporting, and even do governance. And so he has a sort of a profile of sort of a proof of concept in Python which does this. He's built this instrumentation to various systems, and we're writing this up right now. It's still a research project, but I like it because it's an attempt to imagine what we could have, if we had nice things. And even if everyone we talked to said that seems too hard to do, and so it's okay, we'll just build it and show you. Maybe it won't be that hard to do. So I want to sort of conclude with this sort of this framing. I think we can contribute and have been contributing and continue to contribute in these different ways where we sort of decide how we want to talk about problems, decide how we want to measure them, and build the tools that can help us go forward with solving these problems. I just want to thank all the folks I worked with, especially Ruji, and my other students, Michelle, Victor, and Jen Wong, who is actually now at Stanford doing her PhD, a number of my colleagues who I've worked with in all of this, and the Central team, of course. So thank you very much. Do I go? Do I stay? Do I go? Sure.
Have any questions?
That's one right.
Does this work? Okay, cool. I was really interested in the audit trails project.
Yep.
Do you see one downstream use case of that also being the ability to attribute liability to specific agents in like a multi-agent society, or are you only thinking of it from the model, like the frontier model use case?
I think it's possible. I think, we wanted to first frame this as a useful internal diagnostic tool that you as an organization would find something like this useful, even setting aside issues of liability and blame, just to diagnose problems. I think downstream with the idea of, say, a third-party auditor coming in, if, for example, just like with Sarbanes-Oxley and with sort of the medical world, you're required to have these end-to-end audits, then a third-party auditor can come and look at the audit and then try to assign liability or blame as appropriate in that case. So absolutely that's the case. But I think it's useful, even if you're not thinking about the regulatory side of this, just as a useful internal tool to have to understand how your own systems are changing over time. Like, this question of, oh my God, ChatGPT changed their model and now everyone's lost their best friend, because GPT-4 was their best friend. I mean, that's just an illustration, but I think keeping track of what happens when you make these changes is also important. So yes.
Can I make a comment? I just hate the dead airspace. When we're talking about examples of cases in which this kind of thinking and preparation worked, we often cite the ozone layer and smog in Los Angeles as a success case, and then people have ways of saying, well, it doesn't apply now. But I wanted to bring up another case which proves the potential efficacy of this approach, which is Quaaludes. Most of you don't remember the disco age, but the other drug that marked the disco age besides cocaine were Quaaludes, and now most of you haven't even ever heard of Quaaludes because the government took a supply side a regulatory approach to it instead of a demand side, or instead of punishing it afterwards. And now Quaaludes are no longer a problem. We've had other problems since then with the drug use, but fixing the Quaalude problem really did happen, and it's an indicator that fixing this trouble really could happen.
Right, thank you. And I think that's a good point. I think there are kind of waves of our level of enthusiasm for different kinds of regulatory interventions. They sort of ebb and flow over time. There was a period a few years ago when there was a lot of excitement in the regulatory apparatus for intervening. And you mentioned UDAP laws, and I'm thinking of the two cases against Meta, right? One, the case in New Mexico that lost was about essentially deceptive practices. The case in LA that they lost was basically about sort of a bypass around Section 230 to say you can't put out stuff that's addictive, right? And that's not, so I think there are appetites for this, and I'm glad you raised that point, because it is, Actually, I'm very glad you raised the points. I'll tell you why. Because so much of what we talk about with AI right now is so ahistorical that we forget that there is a lot we can learn from the past of what has worked. I mean, when someone says, there's no way you can regulate a technology. No one, once it's out there, it'll never come back. And you say, well, chemical weapons. And then everyone gets very quiet after that, or Quaaludes, right? So I think it's good to imagine we have had the will in the past to do these things. That doesn't mean we should do the exact same thing, but that we can think about it and imagine it, not just automatically rule it out. So thank you.
Hi, I have a question about data ownership. So you mentioned copyright briefly, but it feels like data ownership is a more concerning issue. Like these models are all trained from our personal data, and now these people are making money kind of based on the data that we provided to them. And it feels like there is no sort of compensation to people that contributed. Is there any law in general for like contribution in making this model? I think it could be very broad, like even from the infrastructure. Like, for example, this model uses a lot of electricity. Like you can think about the different actors and contributors that led to creation of AI models, and how do we actually assign contribution to different entities? Thank you.
That's a great question. I don't know, and that doesn't mean it doesn't exist, but I'm not aware of any explicit attempts to legislate or otherwise bring into force some notion of data ownership and compensation for data ownership. I know there's been a lot of thoughts and ideas about how this might look, but I haven't seen any. I think it's an interesting question because the whole concept of data as my private property that I am giving and therefore need to be compensated for is a concept that's alien to a lot of the infrastructure we have with AI right now. So I find that, even being able to say that and sort of say, okay, what would happen if we thought of data as private to myself and that had to be offered and compensated for, changes a lot of the landscape that we've thought about with, whether it comes to sort of data collection or data brokers and who's making money off data. It's a fundamentally different imagining of what data should be and our relationship with data should be. So I feel like perhaps the reason we don't yet have laws is because we haven't really wrestled with that change of conception, and we need to do more of that to then get to the point where we can start thinking about what that would look like. Yeah, but that's sort of a cop-out answer to the question, like, I don't think there is anything right now.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. It was super, super interesting. So your work on the AI regulation, I call it radar because I've done similar research to assess emerging trends in Latin America. So I'm very curious to understand if the model that you guys developed only applies to the US context or it could be applied beyond.
Sorry, which model are you referring to?
The AI taxonomy, the one that you developed to understand the bills that are emerging?
Oh, I see. Right now, our thing is focused on US states. We've had questions from folks saying, can we extend this even further? Which I take as both a sort of a validation of the work itself, but also like, oh shit, we got to figure this out. And so the answer is no, it doesn't quite work. I think the methodology can be made to work, but we should talk.
Yeah,
so,
let's do it.
Thanks. Yeah.
Yeah, that was like super interesting. So thanks for sharing all that. I thought it was really interesting how you talked specifically about framing and how important that was because I hadn't really considered it before. And you mentioned that even when it feels like maybe people disagree a lot on many things and they're very polarized, that framing can be a way to really create some momentum and for progress. And you mentioned the generative versus predictive AI dichotomy and all that. I'm wondering if you had like, just because I'm curious, if you had like a good example of like effective framing that led to some good progress.
There's a conversation I'm recalling that happened like 2 months ago. I'm trying to get the details right. Give me a second. Yeah, I'm drawing a blank. The truth is, and I'll be honest here, a lot of the successes are slowing down the increase of bad things rather than actually good things. There was a time when we were hoping for more good things, but now I think we're playing defense a lot. So that's where it is. I think a lot of the success that I've seen with the conversations that I've had with legislators, especially around these topics, is when they go, basically, literally, oh, I see the difference between these things now. And then that changes a little bit of how they craft or how they write the bills. So I can't point to a specific instance, but I've seen this happen, this aha moment happen over and over again in specific settings, where it's like, okay, if you want to do this, then maybe you should focus on this and not focus on that. Sometimes it doesn't matter because a lot of the politics around these issues is that there's a temptation, okay, we need to write a bill that covers all of AI because otherwise someone will say, well, you missed some important thing. And then we're like, well, but if you write a bill that covers all of AI, you're going to have to do something very different for specific, the thing you do for, say, I don't know, deep fake political news is going to look very different to what you're doing for bias mitigation. You can't write them in the same way. And then sometimes you understand they break them down to separate sections. You now see, for example, a lot more bills will have a definition of automated decision making, a definition of AI, a definition of generative AI, and there'll be different sections that cover different parts of it. And that's helpful. I think there is an argument to be made that we shouldn't be talking about AI in these bills at all, but that's a different story. But I think the fact that you can now see bills go from just an AI definition to something more granular is, I think, a sign of progress in this space. So.
Hello, and thank you. I had a very similar question to yours, and it was more kind of combining the need for framing on top of, you said you had some agents with specific personas of these stakeholders, and based off your knowledge and these agentic stakeholders, kind of what type of framing and specific issue do you think could be the most plausible to be implemented, if not today, or within like this election cycle, the next?
Are you saying which ones have the most traction right now? Which topics have the most traction right now?
Maybe the ones that are more agreeable, not less traction, because traction typically incurs controversy, but
most agreeable.
Yeah, most agreeable.
There's a lot of consensus on concerns around deepfakes, about deepfake porn, about children, about exposure, AI companions. There's a lot of consensus on that. It's sort of bipartisan. Everyone is worried about the children. We can all agree on that. I think that a lot of legislators have said in person that thinking about deepfakes and thinking about things like porn is a way to sort of get into the AI discussions in the legislator's mind without getting to the more complicated discussion around AI regulation and accountability and stuff like that. So there's a lot of traction. There's been a lot of momentum. There's a bunch of work in the states. And the very fact that the most recent administration executive order on AI carved out issues around AI companions, child safety, and porn as something that the states can figure out on their own, even as they still continue to push a moratorium on other aspects of AI, shows that there is a lot of groundswell of interest from both the red states, blue states, everywhere to sort of do something about this. And you're seeing that as well. I think not all the bills are great. There's a variety. But overall, there's been a lot of more interest. Another place where there's a lot of momentum right now is in therapy bots, right? The idea of like, oh, we should, whether on the one hand, like Illinois, you should ban the use of therapy bots in any circumstances, or some other states saying, no, we should allow for them under certain conditions. There's a lot of interest in doing something about this. And again, it's fairly neutral, ideologically at least. That's where I think the technical work, and I'm part of an institute at Brown that's actually called ARIA, which is actually trying to think more about the science and the frameworks for when we can use chatbots safely in these settings. There's a lot of room for technical work to be done there, proper framing, and progress to be made on policy. So I think there are some points of optimism on where progress can be made there.
Thank you very much. We're going to have a short break. There are women's restrooms here on this hallway right here, and men's restrooms on the same floor on the other side. And we'll start right at 3.
Thank you all.
But do you need okay, let me ask.